born in Maslin, New South Wales, and I was the only one of my mother's 6 children that was born in a hospital, because you see there were 3 older boys and Janette, and so Mum used to take a cab every night up to the hospital and sleep the night at the hospital and then come home during the day. Well then, of course, I was born early in the morning, eventually. And when my mother got home, she had a housekeeper, or whatever you like to call her, called Maria. And, Mariah. And when my mother came in with me in her arms, she said, "I wouldn't have your job for £5 a week." That was considered a fortune then. Yes, I wouldn't have your job for £5 a week. And then all the children were born in Maslin, except Alan. But he was 5 years younger than me, so of course when we moved to Rothay, which was in Abbotsford Road in Homebush, and he was born there. And I remember my mother sent the 3 boys away. My eldest brother was 16, and they didn't tell them, mind you, as Harry and Les used to say, they must have thought they were really feeble, that they didn't know Mum was pregnant, because they sent them away to stay with relatives and didn't say anything about Mum having a baby.
So how long did they actually go away for? Were they...
until the baby was born, and then they came back and there was the baby, and they weren't meant to know anything about where it came from or anything. It just arrived.
What a mystery.
And I was 5. I remember seeing, I suppose that was my first memory, because I remember seeing this cradle behind Mum and Dad's bed. You see, they had a double bed, and behind it there was this cradle waiting, It was a marvellous Christmas, because Mum had dressed 2 big celluloid dolls, one each for Janette and I, and she'd made all the clothes and everything, and so they were in a bottom drawer, locked up in Janette and my bedroom, and we knew that we weren't to look. But one day Mum left the key in the door, so we looked, and we saw these dolls, and apparently Janette reckoned, she said to me, "Now you mustn't say anything," but of course the minute I went downstairs, I suppose I was about 3, I said, "Who are the dolls for?" Oh. So Mum sent Janette to bed without any tea, but of course didn't punish me because I was the little one.
Right. Oh dear.
But even though in those days corporal punishment was, very good, but my mother and father never smacked us, ever.
What about the boys?
They didn't believe, well, they might have, I don't know anything about the boys. They were much older, you see, but as far as we were concerned, my mother and father didn't believe in smacking children. And so we were punished like that. We might be sent to bed without any supper. But I don't remember, I was a very, very law-abiding child. I knew that I wanted to please people by doing what I was supposed to do.
Where do you think that comes from?
I don't know. I think it was because I was the 5th, and I was very fond of my parents, and so I wanted to be nice to them. My father and mother had 6 children, and not one of them ever went to a state school. We all went to independent schools. The boys went to grammar, and Janette and I went to Meriden. And my father or mother never had any inherited money until very much later when my Uncle Jim died and left Dad quite a bit of money, but that was after we were all married. I loved the outdoors. I'd always liked it. You know, I used to stay in the country, well, always over the school years. My friend Caroline Raby Moore, who is now Caroline Maslin and lives in Grenfell, well, I used to go up with her May and September holidays always, from the age of about 8 to when I was, well, even after I left school. Used to go up there regularly. And I loved it. We used to muster the sheep for shearing, and we used to help with the shearing, and we used to, in those days, to do the bales of hay, you did it with a hand thing. You know, you pressed them with the hand. Wow. And Caroline and I used to get one each side, because you have to have two people, you know. You have to push it up and down, you know, to press it. Mm-hmm.
Was alcohol a problem in anybody's life that you knew growing up?
Only my mother's. My mother had a sister called Christina. She was a real bad lot. She drank. She was really dipsomaniac. But Mum never talked about it, you see. That was the silly part of it. But she didn't ever tell us, you know, as your mother says now, why? You see, I didn't tell anybody either until, fairly recently, you know. And Barbara said, but why worry? She said, everybody's got somebody in the family that's not absolutely, you know, first class. And this Christina, well, I kept it very dark.
So tell us about her, Christina.
Well, I never met her really, except, I must tell you, when we lived at Highbury, I must have been about 10. And for some reason, I was at home by myself. We had this very big house, you know, surrounded by 2 acres of ground. And I looked out one day and saw coming up the drive this woman. And when she got near, I could see that she was my mother's sister, because she was the image of her. And I sort of vaguely knew about her, but, you know, Mum had never told me really. It sort of was all very dark. Anyway, she came up to the door and said that she was looking for Mrs. Herron, and I said, oh, they don't live here, they moved. She said, where have they gone? And I said, I have no idea. So she said she had no money for fare to get back, so I had to rustle up. We had a live-in gardener and a maid, you know, and I suppose I got the money. I remember getting 2 shillings and giving her the 2 shillings, and she went. And do you know, I never told my mother, ever. And I didn't tell anybody until I told Janette, when Janette was living here. I told her about it, but I kept it to myself all those years. I never said anything about it.
So what did Janette say when you told her?
She was amazed. I think it was terribly grown up of me to when I saw her and knew it was my mother's sister, and I knew there was something, you know, that people kept dark. Mm-hmm. So just why I said to her that they'd moved, I think I was scared. So I just said, no, the Herrons have moved. It was a big household, of course. Poor Mum. She had a cook and a housemaid and a gardener that lived on the premises outside. And at one stage, my father's 2 bachelor brothers came to live with us, Uncle Jim and Uncle Alec. And so that made, you see, there was 8, like 6 children, Mum and Dad, a cook and a housemaid, that's 10, and Uncle Alec and Uncle Jim, that made 12. So eventually, they when Les was 17 and left school, and Mum took him away on a holiday, and she said to my father, I'm not coming back until Uncle Jim and Uncle Alec have gone. Because they'd lived with them for 4 years. And you can imagine, and you see in those days, when the dinner was ready, there would be a pile of plates like this, even for the staff. So that was 12 plates like this. And at one end my mother sat with the vegetables, and the other end my father sat with the meat. And he'd carve the meat or serve the meat, and it was passed up to Mum. And then everybody got it, and then they'd serve 2 lots for the maids, and then they'd ring the bell and they'd come in and take theirs out to the kitchen. So you can imagine my mother was fed up. Mm-hmm. So they did, and you see, there were 7 boys and 1 girl in my father's family. And the girl, who was Mary, I was called after her, she only had 2 children, and she lived in Cremorne. So the uncles went and lived with her. Why they didn't get a place of their own, I'll never know. Nell was born when I was at school. All the girls were terribly envious because of me being an auntie when I was at school. They were nice children. You know, I used to have them to stay a lot when they were little.
When did you learn how to drive?
I got my licence on the day I was 17, because in Sydney you get your licence when you're 17. And the day I was 17, I went and got my licence, and the policeman said to me, married or single? And I was delighted.
That's great. And how difficult was it to get your license at that point to drive? How difficult was it to get your license to drive?
Not a bit difficult.
Yeah,
no, you just drove around in a circle. I'd been driving the car for ages.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you drove a car? How old you were?
I suppose I did it till I was about 16. 15 or 16.
Yeah.
But my father, you know, he was very modern in that way. And he was a hopeless driver. See, when we got our first car, which was an Adler, it was built on the chassis of a German tank. It was a German car. And my father, see, in those days that you didn't have to have a licence. And my father was hopeless. He was no good at mechanics at all. And I remember he used to have to drive, he couldn't back, so he used to have to drive along to find somewhere to turn around. And I remember once we'd all been, all of us could sit in the car because there were dicky seats, you know. And we came home and we'd nearly gone over a cliff, and Mum made us all kneel down and pray because we'd been saved.
Was she religious? Was your mother religious?
Yes, quite. Always went to church. She and Dad went to church every Sunday. You know, not unpleasantly so, but they were always very friendly with the vicar, or at least he wasn't the vicar. They were Presbyterian. The entertainment in those days, we all had parties at home. And you see, we had a ballroom and a gramophone and a piano, of course, but Janette or I were allowed to have as many visitors as we liked at the weekend or anything, as long as we did the cooking ourselves. I mean, we didn't provide much. We'd have them. A lot of times we had a tennis court. We'd have tennis in the afternoon, and then they'd stay on to the evening meal, and we'd dance. Mum and Janette and I at home, and I can remember we had the library, and it had an alcove like that with nice windows and everything, and we used to have lunch in there. We'd put up a table, and Ada used to wheel the lunch in on a trainmobile, you know, and we'd have our lunch there. The 3 of us, mind you, doing nothing. Then in the summer, 6 of us, 5 friends and me, we used to have together, we'd go once a week down to the beach and surf. And we used to take it in turns to take the car. So, you could have your family's car. And whoever took the car took the lunch. But so you only had to do it once every 6 weeks. And we used to go to Cronulla.
So when you say you would surf, would you actually surf on a surfboard?
Body surf.
Body surf. Okay,
yeah.
body surf. Yeah.
Yes, it was great. But lovely surf down there. Their house, Yothani, was on the way home. I used to walk home from school, and I always had to pass their house. And Margaret and I used to walk as far as her house together, and I'd often go in. And Robert used to want me to bath him. He was 12 years younger. And he was like John, he was very tall. Dad, his youngest brother, Albert, we saw a lot of them. He was married to Auntie Jessie, and they had 3 boys and a girl, Jean. Jean was about my age. And when I was up in Sydney, when Philip had some sort of a conference and we were living in Manly, we had this apartment in Manly, and I looked up the telephone book and I rang Jean, and we had a long talk. She was still alive.
Was she the one you were closest with out of that family?
That's right. Yes, she was. And then on my mother's side, my mother's brother, Andrew, he had Dorrie. You've heard us talk about Dorrie Ledley, and she was our first cousin, and she was sweet. She was lovely, lovely to look at too. And she married Harold Ledley, who was a doctor. And then we used to see a lot of her. Because Dorrie was a great provider of food. She used to come up, she and her husband, they used to come up to Hydebrae for lunch at Christmas. And we used to have always lunch. And then we'd go out to Bondi. He had a practice in Bondi, and we used to go out there and go for a swim. And then we came back and had a hot shower, and I thought this was absolutely the best thing, because we would never have been allowed to, have hot showers in the afternoon as well as in the morning, because my parents were very economical. Mm-hmm. And then she used to make these ice cream sodas. A lot of my memories of my youth were about food. I think I must have been terribly greedy, because I remember thinking, food is, I've always remembered food. Mm-hmm. And John, of course, wasn't there because he wasn't very strong, and he went to the country. The doctor told, the specialist told Mum that, he had a spot on his lung and he should go and lead an outdoor life. So he went up to Queensland, to Longreach, on this property that belonged to a friend of Liz's, or his family. And he was jackaroo up there, and he hated it. So when my brother Les was going to be married, he asked John to be his best man. So John asked for the time off to come down, and they wouldn't give it to him. They said no. So my father wrote to John and said, look, you're not very happy there. If you like, you can leave and come down for the wedding, and you can come into my office. And that's what John did. And he was a great success. And by that time, he was quite strong. Well, he married Mary and had 4 children. She was really nice. And, a great wife.
Do you have a favorite birthday? Looking back on all your birthdays, one that was memorable?
Yes, my 21st birthday I loved. I had a party, and I remember we had a bit of a discussion as to whether we would have any alcohol, because in those days you didn't have alcohol at parties.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you just had fruit cup. And so in the end we decided to have claret cup. But that was all, no beer or anything, and everybody enjoyed themselves, you know. We danced and so we had that. We had fruit punch and claret cup. I don't know whether anybody drank claret cup. I certainly didn't. I was a teetotaler till I was 40. You know, at Narrabeen they had grandfather actually had a cottage down there. And that was the first time I met John, because although I knew Margaret, he was a boarder at King's. You see, at King's School you've got to be a boarder. And so that's where he was educated. And so I met him. And he was 16 or something. And when I went home, he said to Molly, he said, "That's the girl I'm going to marry one day if I ever get the chance." I was the only girl he ever took out.
So did you think the same thing about him?
No, I went out with lots of people.
Mm-hmm.
So when did you first feel that you would say you were in love with John?
Oh, I
Was
think
it
when I was
a
about
moment?
21. My wedding day was the happiest day of my life. It was lovely. You know, we'd been engaged for quite a while, and in those days there was no thought of anybody living together. Goodness, you would have been ostracised. So when you got married and went on your honeymoon, it was a really, you know, there was something about it. Like everybody misses that now, you know, but it was wonderful, you know, and of course I was so ignorant about everything, but I was so lucky to marry such a nice man.
Well,
He couldn't get over me being so ignorant.
That's great.
I knew nothing,
What was
but I loved it all. I mean, it was great. It wasn't a terrible shock to me at all.
That's great.
You know, it was because I was, you know, we were very much in love with each other, and still were when he went to war. When he left school, he did law, and he wasn't the sort of person that could, you know, not like my brother Les, who had a photographic memory and only used to do really big work just 2 weeks before the exams, you know, and get through.
Mm-hmm.
But John had to work quite hard all the year you know, to get through his exams. You know, he was adequate because he got through his exams, but I mean, he wasn't brilliant. And when the war broke out, he'd just been given all the council work. You know, he was doing really well. It was a shame, really. Anyway, let's talk about that. It's a bit late now. And in 1945, I was asked to go on the executive of the War Widows Guild. You know, it was formed because until that formed, the only people that ever spoke for the war widows was Legacy, and they're hopeless because that's a, it's a whole lot of men that are sort of self-appointed. And men really haven't got any idea of what it means for a woman to be left on her own. You see, every man that went to the war was A, fit in health. They were young. They hadn't had a chance to make, they were just starting in life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them had mortgages, and they bought furniture on time payment and all this sort of thing. And of course, most of the women had never owned a checkbook. They'd used their husbands doing all the finance, and they were left high and dry, and nobody was there to help them. And Mrs. Vasey, who started the War Widows Guild, she was a wonderful woman. Her husband, General Vasey, he was killed. And so Margaret Gregg, Margaret Mackay, mm-hmm. Janette's sister-in-law, she was very friendly with Beryl Rigall, who her husband was killed too. And so she was with Mrs. Vasey starting this. She was the secretary of it. As a matter of fact, it was a paid job for her. And so Margaret told them, and so Mrs. Vasey rang me and said, would I go on the executive, because as I was a war widow, and I worked with them for 5 years. I was the honorary federal secretary and treasurer, and Preston Motors gave us a station wagon, and so I used to drive Mrs. Vasey everywhere. She didn't drive, and I used to drive around because she started these groups in different country towns. And it's a wonderful thing for the war widows, because when the war ended, for instance, me as a captain's wife and widow, I got £2 a week.
How would that correlate to now? What would
the basic wage in 1945 was £4.7 and 6 a week.
Okay.
And so that was £2. And you see, they used to get the idea that because you're only one person, it costs half the amount, but of course with no man in the house it costs double, because you've got to get somebody in to do the jobs that your husband would have done. I wasn't typical because I had more money, because for one thing John had an insurance policy, which was an income policy, and I used to get so much a week for 20 years and then got a lump sum. You never think when you're in your, like John was, when we were married, he was 22 and he took out this policy when he was 22, never thinking, that he'd need it. But, and also, I had my family behind me. My parents were very good to me, and so you wouldn't say I was typical, but I understood exactly. I mean, I wasn't rolling in money or anything, and John and I had built our own house in Fairfield, and although we didn't completely own it, we almost did, because we were so economical when we were young. We didn't spend a penny that we didn't have to. We didn't have a car. I never spent money on clothes, and we never went out to a meal, ever. We had our fun was having people to dinner and playing bridge, and that's how we got our fun.
Was that typical of the time, or
yes,
atypical?
It was typical of the people I lived with, because Strathfield was a sort of a middle-class suburb with prosperous people in it, not high-flowing people, but everybody was prosperous, and they all lived in nice houses and, had staff and...
us why you did start drinking at 40? Because I like that story.
How do you?
Yeah.
Because I went for a trip to England and I found out that a lemon squash was a shilling and a pink gin was 4p. And I thought, gosh, I'm on the wrong thing here. So I decided to drink. And then you couldn't get anybody to put just a little bit of Angostura, which makes it pink, so then I just drank gin and water for the rest of the time. And then for some totally unknown reason, I've given up drink. The last, I suppose it's a year, I haven't drunk anything and I don't want it. I'm hooked on lemon squash. It's Margaret Scobie. She married a man in the diplomatic service. In fact, he was the ambassador in Paris when I was in England the first time in 1950, and the Davis Cup was being played there, so she entertained me there. There's a photograph, on the thing of me, on the wall, and I've got a brown dress with white spots and a hat.
Yeah.
Well, that was then, when that was taken in Paris. I went for a trip to England, and when I came back, it was 1953, and I thought to myself, look, I'm youngish, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? See, I'd never had a job. My father wouldn't let Janette or I work. He said a woman's place was in the home, and he wouldn't allow us to work. So we'd all just stopped at home and got married. So anyway, I thought, the children are getting older, and Andrew, of course, was a boarder at Scotch, and Barbara said she wanted to be a boarder at St Catherine's, so she was, and there was I. What was I going to do? So I decided there were I could have learned to type or something, but I didn't like the idea. So I bought 30 acres in Humphreys Road, at Chetwyn Park. And it had quite a nice little house on it, just a weatherboard house, but it had a distant view of the bay. And Janette and Stuart said, look, you can't go and live there by yourself. It was miles off the road and everything. I said, of course I can. Anyway, I bought it. It was a really good buy. And I went to live there, and then I decided I'd have ducks. So I used to have, eventually, after a few months, I had 400-day-old ducks a fortnight. But before that, I had to get everything ready. I bought second-hand brooders. You see, you've got to put them in heated brooders. They have heat for 2 weeks and then a week inside without heat, and then you put them out on free range. And so I had a big area at the back, fenced, big high fence, like a fox-proof fence, with 2 lots of 42-inch netting, and it leaned over at the top, which stopped foxes getting in. Mm-hmm. And I put on I had these drinkers. See, ducks have got to be able to put their head underwater. So I had these drinkers made. They were about that deep, and then I fixed them up with plastic hose and those little fittings that you have for hot water services, at the end, and with a ball cock on. And so all the drinkers, they just naturally filled up themselves and stopped. I did all that. I didn't know much about it, but I went round and saw other places that had ducks and everything.
So how long did you how long did they go free range for, and then what did you...
So then I used to sell, they were Muscovy ducks, and you have to sell for eating. Mm-hmm. You have to sell the ducks at 14 weeks and the drakes at 16 weeks, just exactly, because otherwise they start to get their pin feathers and then they get tough. And my ducks were beautiful, they really were. I haven't had a decent one since. And they weighed really quite, the ducks were about 5 or 6 pounds when they were dressed, and the drakes about 10 to 12 pounds, which is, quite a lot.
So did you sell them living?
I sold them there live. I sold them to Sunbeam, which was a place that they would come and they would take them away alive, you see. So that was easy. And then the rest of the land eventually I had it fenced and drinkers put in. And I remember, Andrew used to come down the weekend and he loved it. It was really good for him because he learned. Fortunately, I got onto this man. I had to have a plumber because this plumber had put in we only had tank water, and he'd put in the pump on this underground tank we pumped it up to a high tank, and that's our water supply. Well, something went wrong with it, and I had to get there, and his name was Tink the plumber. Wasn't it a lovely name? Anyway, when he came, I said, look, I really need some help, with somebody. I said, do you know anybody that would be willing to work at the weekend, for extra? Oh, yes, he said, I do. I know the very person I've got working for me, Wally Bell. So he came every weekend. And Andrew learned such a lot from Wally. It was marvellous, because he learned all about draining, and that's been how Andrew's been so handy, building. He didn't build his own house, but he did an awful lot of work, for it, and that's where he learned to do it. And he loved it. But I remember having Bruce down for the weekend, and when he came down he found he was expected to work because he and Andrew put in this drinker for the cattle that I was having, and I used to get 12 steers once a year, and then I'd fatten them up and sell them and then get 12 more. So it was good.
That's great.
And obviously I got a bit of help from Wally, but between me and that sort of help, I dug 1,500 feet of trench to put a pipe in to go. I put in a big dam, you see, and it looked so big. I thought, I'll never fill that. Do you know it filled overnight? We had this terrific rain, and it ran in and it all overflowed. I remember rushing outside in the night, and I thought, what's going to happen? Because it was all overflowing. And it overflowed into the creek. You see the creek that comes down, Sweetwater Creek in Frankston, well, it started up in my place. Anyway,
so
it all worked out really well, and so I had to have this pipe that went from the dam to 2 tanks that I had over this shed where the brooders were.
Mm-hmm.
And then at one stage I thought I'd grow some potatoes, and so I bought this seed potato, a big sack of seed potatoes, which was quite expensive, but they were good. But then, having talked to a whole lot of people, they said, look, you're mad to do that, because what about harvesting them and it would be awful. So I put all these seedling potatoes out, to keep them, you've got to do that to keep them right, because otherwise they'd go bad. And I sold them back to the place where I bought them at a profit. So that was good. And then at Christmas, I had a shop. There was a shop down at Frankston, Mrs. Axford's shop. that was opposite the football ground, and she, I don't know how I came to go there, but she said she would take as many dressed ducks or drakes as I could produce, because she had a few clients that would always take them. So if I wanted to make any pocket money, I would do these. And Barbara and Andrew at Christmas, they used to do it and make money, but Barbara, they gave her hay fever, so she couldn't do them.
So
But
the dressed duck just plucked and...
Yes, you pluck them. You have to kill them and pluck them, but I used to do it. But on the whole, I would say that the whole thing was a lucrative hobby.
Okay.
And so it was good. And you know, Geraldine reckons that that's why I'm so strong now. And Marcus reckons that Geraldine wants him to buy her a farm so she can have ducks and everything, so that she'll live a long time. John and Ben, they came. You see, they were the last ones that I took. And we were going up to the Blue Mountains, and Dorry lived at Penrith, so we called him there for lunch. John was 11. Anyway, when we were going, John said to Dorry, "Thank you very much for having me. The lunch was much nicer than I thought it was going to be." Ben was particularly clever at language. You know, he had a terrific grasp of the English language. He always used big words.
I think he still does.
And I used to have him a lot, because see, he was about 18 months, I think, or a year when Philip came to Melbourne and was the headmaster there. And of course he was the fifth child, and they were, you know, it was a very big job. And the other children were all at school. And Ben needed to be looked after. And they didn't have any live-in help or anything. You know, they had Hazel.
Oh, Hazel too.
First of all, they had Hazel. And Ben used to call the vacuum cleaner Hazel. And he would say, "Hazel, Hazel." We used to want the vacuum cleaner. He loved to play with it. And he thought the name of the vacuum cleaner was Hazel.
After the lady.
But I used to have him to stay here a lot before he went to school. And, you know, he was so good. You know, he didn't need much looking after. We used to get along really well together. He used to come in the morning to my room, and we'd play this game about Chauncey Gardner. I don't know where I made it up, but we used to have to play this game every morning when I was happy. I've always taken my tea back to bed, you know, well, certainly ever since I've lived here. And so he would come in, and then when he was about, I suppose, 6 or 7, he was staying here, and he was into this Kai Chi, or whatever you call it, you know?
Tai Chi.
And he had this...
Oh, Goju Kai. He did, didn't he?
Yes, and he had this white thing on with a belt, you know? And he used to put this on in the morning. He'd go over there where that seat is, and he'd be doing this and everything. And I said, "People wonder." He said, "I don't mind." And so then I remember he said one morning he was going to run from one end of the beach to the other and back. And he said, "Now, I've worked it out." He said, "It's going to take me about 20 minutes. So when I come back," he said, "I'll be ready for my porridge." And I was in bed with me, and I had to hop up and make the porridge so that when he got back it was all cooked ready for him to eat. Yes, yes, I've worked it out. He said, "It'll take me to run to the end of the rocks and back. It'll be 20 minutes. So when I get back, I'm ready for my porridge."
He's a funny little guy.
Yes, he was really lovely, you know. I suppose you were about 3 or 4, and for some reason or other, I must have gone out, because Janette gave you all. Well, Ben was here, so you must have been over 5 because Ben was in a high chair, and so Janette gave you cutlets, and so she put it in front of you naturally, and you said, "What's this gigantic thing on my plate?" It was only a little tiny French cutlet.
You need to put your dinner on.
Yes, I
Yeah,
will.
Sorry,
I was going to say that.
We'll
I don't
let
want
you
to. Yeah,
go.
we should
We'll
let
get
you
that
get
next
better.
time.
Some other time.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
exactly.